Carl, can I tell you a secret? I kind of secretly hate talking about Kant, because every time I talk about Kant, I have to put up with students making all these puns about his name. And then each time they do it, I have to act like it's clever and exciting and new. They're all like, I can't believe Kant says you can't lie, regardless of the context. I can't continue to contend that I'm content to accept Kant's controversial claims because they contrast with or even contradict my own. It's like, I get it. There's a lot of words in the English language that start with the letter C-O-N-T. Can we move on? In previous episodes in this video series, we've explored various views of justice, including utilitarianism and libertarianism. In this episode, we're going to explore the theory, sometimes referred to as deontology, developed by the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant was a contemporary. Contemporary. Oh, man. Anyway, Kant was a contemporary of Jeremy Bentham, who, as you may recall, is considered the father of utilitarianism. In fact, it was partly in response to Bentham's theory that Kant wrote his own. And just like Bentham's theory, Kant's theory has had a tremendous impact on modern-day ethics. Kant actually helped pave the way for the notion of universal human rights. In his book on justice, Michael Sandel spends 26 pages discussing utilitarianism, which includes both a summary of and criticism of both Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. He devotes only 16 pages to libertarianism, which again includes a pretty substantial focus on critiquing that view. But Sandel spends 36 pages discussing Kant, and not a lot of that is devoted to criticism. This raises an interesting question. Does he spend that much time on Kant because Kant is more complicated and requires more nuance, or does he spend that much time on Kant because he likes Kant more? Well, given that his criticisms of Kant seem to be a lot softer than his criticisms of Bentham and Mill, I'm going to suggest he likes Kant's theory more than that of Bentham or Mill. At any rate, Kant's theory is rather complicated. I'm going to try and simplify it here as best I can. To get a fuller understanding of Kant's theory, check out some of the links in the description below. The first, and perhaps one of the most important things to know about Kant's theory, is that he accepts that some actions are right or wrong regardless of the outcome that they produce. They are inherently right or wrong in and of themselves. Think back to the idea we discussed earlier about torturing the innocent child of a terrorist in order to save a lot of lives. Some of you are probably hesitant to accept that torturing an innocent child was acceptable, even if it did save a bunch of lives. You might think that torturing an innocent child is wrong regardless of how many lives it saves. If you think this, you have something in common with Kant. If there are some actions that are inherently right and inherently wrong, how do we know which is which? To understand Kant's answer, we have to understand his idea of the categorical imperative. For Kant, the categorical imperative is basically the foundation for all other ethics. The categorical imperative is a moral truth that applies in every situation without exception. If we know the categorical imperative, we'll know what actions are right and what actions are wrong. Kant offers two primary versions of the categorical imperative, but he argues that they both amount to the same thing. Let's take a look at these two forms of the categorical imperative now. To understand the first form of the categorical imperative, it's important to know what the term maxim means. No, Carl, not the magazine. Seriously, what's the matter with you? Anyway, a maxim is just an underlying principle justifying an action. Every moral action that we commit probably has a maxim underlying it, rationalizing it, justifying it. For example, imagine that I'm starving through no fault of my own, and I need food. Someone else has a lot of food, more than they need, and so I take some of that food in order to survive. I might suggest that there's a principle justifying this action. The principle might be something like, it's acceptable to take food from someone who has more than they need if you don't have enough to survive. Now, whether or not you accept this maxim is beside the point. It's just an example of a maxim, a principle that justifies an action. Now that we know what a maxim is, we can look at Kant's first formulation of the categorical imperative. Act in such a way that you would find it acceptable if everyone else lived according to the maxim justifying your action. An example might be helpful here. Some of you probably think it's morally acceptable to lie in certain situations. Think of a situation in which you might lie. Now, take a few moments and think about the maxim underlying that action. That is, what's the principle that justifies you lying in that situation? It's actually a bit trickier than it sounds. For example, if I suggest the maxim, it is morally acceptable to lie when you're doing it for the benefit of another person, that maxim has some problems with it. For example, that maxim could justify a cheating spouse lying to their partner in order to spare them the harm of learning about their affairs. They're lying for the benefit of their partner, but most of us would reject that this is an acceptable lie. That means that we can't accept that everyone live according to that maxim. We would have to refine our maxim a bit more. For Kant, if you can universalize instrumentalize your maxim. That is, if you can accept that everyone else live according to that maxim, then you have a categorical imperative on your hand. Or at least a categorical imperative that derives from the master categorical imperative. Kant's second form of the categorical imperative is, always treat persons as ends in themselves and never merely as means to an end. To understand this maxim, we have to understand that Kant divides the world into two basic categories: persons and things. And for Kant, there's no in between. You're either one or the other. Because Kant relies on the concept of person for one of his master categorical imperatives, it's important for us to know what person means. For Kant, a person is a rational creature, a creature who is able to act on more than just instinct or inclination. A rational creature is able to act freely, not simply because they desire something, but because they freely choose something regardless of their desires. If you're lost, don't worry. I'll explain that idea a bit more in a few moments. Kant argues that human beings, or at least most human beings, are persons. That is, they're rational creatures. And for Kant, if you are a person, you warrant direct moral consideration. This means that persons have moral value in and of themselves, regardless of how productive they are, or how talented they are, or how intelligent they are. They matter morally simply because they exist. Kant summarizes this idea by saying persons are ends in themselves. In other words, they're not stepping stones. They can't simply be used and discarded to accomplish some greater good. You can probably see the foundations for the idea of universal human rights here. So what if you're not a person? Everything in the world that's not rational, and Kant includes all non-human animals in this category, is not a person, but a thing. And for Kant, things exist to be used. They don't warrant moral consideration in and of themselves. For Kant, any duty that we have to things are indirect duties. For example, I have a duty or obligation not to kill my neighbor's dog. But this obligation is not to the dog, it's to my neighbor, because the neighbor's dog, according to Kant, is my neighbor's property. So in not killing the dog, I'm respecting not the dog, but my neighbor. At its heart, the categorical imperative suggests that we ought to treat humans with respect, as ends in themselves. This is how we know if actions are right or wrong. They're right if they respect persons, they're wrong if they don't respect persons. So torturing the child is wrong because it treats the child as a mere means to an end, to saving other lives. Likewise, things like sexual assault are wrong because they instrumentalize other persons for sexual gratification, treating them merely as means to an end. But that's only part of Kant's moral theory. Kant maintains that you can do the right thing, but still not be morally praiseworthy because you do it for the wrong reasons. This raises the question, what is the right reason to do something? And for Kant, the answer is simple: duty. You are morally praiseworthy if you do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, because you have a duty to do it. This idea can lead to some weird outcomes. For instance, if you see someone who is suffering and you decide to help them because you have compassion for them, for Kant, you're not morally praiseworthy because you're acting out of an inclination or a feeling of compassion, not primarily for the sense of duty. That might seem a little bit odd, but it does make a certain kind of sense. After all, if we help people because we have a sense or feeling of compassion for them, when we don't have that feeling of compassion, we won't help people. For Kant, you're more inclined to do the right thing out of duty when you don't feel like doing the right thing. That is, when you don't have an inclination to do it, but you do it anyway. But there's another reason why Kant finds duty important. To understand why, we have to look at Kant's understanding of freedom or autonomy. The word autonomy comes from the Greek combination of auto, which means self, and nomos, which means law. So autonomy literally translates as self-law. For Kant, to be autonomous is literally to give yourself your own law. Kant maintains that only rational creatures can act autonomously because only rational creatures can choose to act against their instincts and inclinations. All other creatures act according to external laws or according to their own desires, which they didn't choose. This explains in part why Kant doesn't think that someone who helps another person because they have compassion on them is morally praiseworthy. They're acting out of an inclination, not out of a sense of duty, out of a law that they give to themselves. Similarly, if someone doesn't lie because they're afraid of getting caught or they're afraid that they might tarnish their own reputation, this person also is acting out of an inclination or desire, not out of a sense of duty. You're only morally praiseworthy if the primary reason that you act is a sense of duty. Of course, you can still feel like doing the right thing and act out of a sense of duty, but you can't act because you feel that way. You have to act in spite of the fact that you feel that way. So for Kant, only the person who acts the right way for the right reason is morally praiseworthy. It's important to make one more distinction in Kant's ethics, and this is a distinction that Sandow doesn't make, and that's the difference between perfect duties and imperfect duties. Perfect duties are always binding in every situation. imperfect duties are binding, but not always and in every situation. And Kant maintains that we have perfect and imperfect duties to ourselves, as well as to others. This sets the stage for 4 different categories of duties: perfect duties to self, perfect duties to others, imperfect duties to self, and imperfect duties to others. Perfect duties tend to be negative commands. For example, Kant maintains that we have a perfect duty not to lie. We also have a perfect duty not to make promises that we have no intention on keeping. You can see how these tend to be perfect duties toward others. Don't lie to others, don't make promises you don't intend to keep to others. Kant also maintains that we have a perfect duty to ourselves not to commit suicide. For Kant, committing suicide disrespects persons, in particular, this person. These are perfect duties because Kant maintains we are obligated to follow them regardless of the situation. So what about imperfect duties? It's important to note that imperfect doesn't mean optional. Imperfect duties are still duties. They're still obligations. What makes them imperfect is that we don't have to follow them all the time in every situation. For instance, Kant maintains that we have an imperfect duty to help others. But we can't spend all of our lives helping others constantly because there's always someone who needs help. We would never get anything else done. So we don't have a perfect duty to help others. Kant also maintains that we have an imperfect duty to take care of ourselves. For instance, by eating and drinking. But you might find yourself in a situation, perhaps you're very ill, where you can't eat and drink on your own and you require help from others, or you require surgery or some other kind of medical care that you can't provide for yourself. In this case, you're relying on others to take care of you. So taking care of yourself is not a perfect duty because we need others to help us take care of ourselves. Let's take a moment and summarize Kantian ethics up to this point. According to Kant, some actions are inherently right and inherently wrong. Actions are right or wrong depending on whether or not they violate the categorical imperative. That is, that they treat persons as things rather than as persons. But doing actions that are inherently right or avoiding actions that are inherently wrong isn't enough for Kant. You also have to act for the right motive, that is, for the sake of duty. To be morally praiseworthy, you must act autonomously, according to a law that you give yourself, not according to your inclinations, your desires, or any other external law, such as laws of nature. Let's take a few moments to evaluate. There's a lot to like about Kant. His ethics ground universal human rights, which most of us like. And in line with universal human rights, most of us probably think that some actions, like rape or torture of the innocent, are inherently wrong. That is, it doesn't matter the situation in which you commit these acts, you're wrong if you commit them. But as I noted, I think Sandeau goes a lot easier on Kant than he goes on Bentham and Mill. So I'm going to spend some time unpacking 3 criticisms of Kant here. First, Kant's argument about his categorical imperative seems problematic. Kant maintains that all rational beings, if they're being rational, will accept his categorical imperative. But Bentham and Mill and other philosophers since then have rejected Kant's categorical imperative. For Kant's position to work, he must maintain that all of these philosophers are acting irrationally. But why should we assume that? Given how many variations there are about the foundations of morality, it seems to make more sense to assume that rational agents will come to different conclusions about the foundation of morality. But Kant won't do this. Second, one of Kant's formulations about the categorical imperative asks if we can universalize our maxims. But this claim doesn't tell us how to act specifically. Again, Kant seems to assume that all persons, if they're acting rationally, will agree on how to act based on the categorical imperative. But it's unclear that this is the case. For example, based on his categorical imperative, Kant maintains that lying is always wrong. However, many rational people have argued that lying is acceptable in certain circumstances. And it seems possible that they could formulate a maxim that they would be willing to universalize to support this claim. In other words, a rational person might be okay universalizing a maxim that allows lying in certain situations. Kant's theory can't really make sense of this reality, and he seems to ignore the problem. Third, Kant's theory of morality lends itself to a dangerous legalism. Again, take his position on lying. Kant maintains that lying is inherently wrong, regardless of the circumstance or the outcome. He even argues that it would be wrong to lie to protect an innocent person from a murderer. Now, Kant has some reasons for making this claim. He maintains that we don't know what the outcome of the lie will actually be. We just know what we intend it to be. But still, if we take Kant's argument seriously, we have to conclude that all of the people in Nazi Germany who lied to protect Jews from the Nazis were in fact acting immorally. And that seems like a very counterintuitive, perhaps even irrational, conclusion to accept. There are other critiques of Kant, but these 3 criticisms help us to understand some key issues with his moral theory. In this episode, we explored the moral theory of Immanuel Kant. We also provided some brief criticisms of it. In our next episode, we're going to look at a modern and influential interpretation of Kant that emphasizes the importance of positive liberty. This is the view of John Rawls. Until then, farewell.